Thank you, everyone, for joining Mayer Brown's Technology Transactions Practice webinar. Our program today will focus on how RPA and AI will change outsourcing. I will first cover a couple of administrative matters, and then we'll get started. We will be scheduling periodic calls and webinar programs on technology transactions topics, so watch your inboxes for future invitations, and feel free to spread the word to others who might be interested. You can also find many past programs on the Technology Transactions webpage at www.mayerbrown.com. Our goal is to provide practical and strategic advice to help you secure high-value technology contracts, improve your operations, build digital platforms, and achieve compliance. During today's presentation, you will be provided with an alphanumeric code. If you are applying for continuing legal education or CLE credit, you will need to record that code on the virtual sign-in sheet that you received by email with the connection details. You'll find the directions for returning that virtual sign-in sheet on that virtual sign-in sheet. We will read the code in the middle of the presentation and then again at the end of the presentation. We do plan to allow time at the end of the program for questions. To submit a question electronically, please use the Q&A panel in WebEx. If we don't get to your question during this webinar, we will make every effort to follow up with you after this webinar and answer that question. This webinar is being recorded, as we normally do with these programs. In a day or so, we will be sending you an email with a link, and you can use the link to listen to the webinar again or to share it with your colleagues. The recording will also be posted to our website. My name is Brad Peterson, and I'm delighted to participate with my partner, Rohit George, on today's topic. I, Brad Peterson, am a partner in Mayer Brown's Chicago office and leader of the Technology Transactions practice. I'm pleased to introduce my fellow presenter, Rohit George. Rohit is a partner in the Technology Transactions practice in Mayer Brown's Palo Alto office. Rohit's practice focuses on assisting companies in a wide range of commercial, strategic, and technology transactions, including contracting for cloud services, emerging technologies, mission-critical software, and outsourcing. So, with that brief introduction, let's get started on today's program. Rohit, would you like to take us through the agenda?
Sure, thanks, Brad. Our discussion today will cover these 5 topics. First, we're going to talk about what robotic process automation and artificial intelligence actually are. We'll get some examples of that and how it's used in practice. Then we're going to talk about some of the new capabilities that have opened up for companies with RPA and AI utilized within the outsourcing space. Then we're going to talk about the trends. Where are we in the trend for adoption for these 2 technologies in the outsourcing industry? Next, we'll talk a little bit about the effect these technologies will have on outsourcing. And finally, and very importantly, we'll talk about what do these technologies mean in terms of your outsourcing contracts. How do you contract for RPA and AI in your outsourcing arrangements, and how is it different from how you currently contract?
So let's start with what is robotic process automation, or RPA? RPA, or robotic process automation, are software tools, not physical robots, that are designed to follow the exact, manual path taken through applications by humans using the user interface or connections to servers, mainframes, or HTML code. An RPA application is often called a robot, although, again, it's not a physical robot and it doesn't meet the definition of a robot. Once started, the robot follows the same pathways that a person would follow. And some of these RPA products include some cognitive and artificial intelligence capabilities. These are used for processes that are manual, repetitive, and rule-based. And RPA gives companies the opportunity to map out a business process that's definable, repeatable, and rules-based, and then have the software robot manage the execution of that process. And the RPA software is running at what's called the presentation layer. The computer software developers think of computing environments in layers: the physical or hardware layer, the operating system layer, the database layer, the applications layer, perhaps a networking layer, and the user layer, which was generally a human user. And the critical piece here is that RPA suppliers providing new RPA tools are transforming the way we look at computing so that some of the things at the presentation level layer are being done by software from companies like Automation Anywhere or Blue Prism.
One of the powerful advantages of RPA in particular is that it can work with your existing systems. As Paul just mentioned, it in effect operates as a replacement for a human user. It can operate at that presentation layer, although that's not the only place it can do so. It can also operate through APIs connected to your system. So what does that mean? Well, what it means is that it doesn't require a company to incur great expense or alter existing infrastructure and systems in order to use this technology. RPA, in effect, provides sort of the connective tissue between systems. So, for example, if you're an insurance company and you have a legacy claims intake system and you may have an individual whose job or role it is to take the relevant information for a particular claim and then input it into a separate legacy system to advance the claim to the next stage of processing. This kind of connective tissue between two legacy systems can be automated with a software robot. And sometimes also, as we'll talk further later, between your legacy system and a new system that you may want to implement or create that's more user-friendly or it's connected to some emerging technologies, that may be a scenario as well. One thing about robotic process automation is that it is, you know, as Brad said, it is robotic, and that means it requires very structured data. So you have to be able to define very clearly and predictably what data in a particular system the software robot will be looking for, and perhaps how it will deposit that or take that data and deposit it in a destination system. And finally, the types of processes that lend themselves best to use with RPA are, in fact, the very types of processes that lend themselves to offshore outsourcing. These are typically clerical processes that are simple and transactional in nature. They will not require much, if any, analysis or subject of, judgment. And so you can probably, as you can probably intuitively understand then, this presents somewhat of a threat to outsourcing companies, and we'll talk about that more later. Now, an example of where RPA is being used is we have up on screen here, and I think it's a pretty good illustration of how it can work. In this instance, we had a construction engineering business that had to send hundreds of invoices per month to customers. Now, collecting these invoices probably involved hundreds of pages of supporting data from dozens of different systems. And as you can imagine, it involves pasting details on project progress, providing time detail, collecting invoices from third parties, verifications, acceptance certificates, so forth. This effort actually took the company about 5 hours for each invoice, and the company reported that now it only takes about 11 minutes for each invoice using software robots to perform these functions. As you can imagine, this involves millions of dollars of savings, not to mention the increased accuracy associated with using software robots versus people. Another example is in the financial industry. There was, one example or illustration where there were 11 bank employees that were assigned to monitor about 2,500 very high-risk customer accounts to determine whether payment demands should be either processed or rejected or returned. Now that work is done by 20 bots, leaving those 11 employees to do what is doubtless a much more interesting work, much more higher value work than what they were previously doing.
So with that, let's go on to what is artificial intelligence, or AI? AI is not the magic that you might see in movies. The AI systems are not humans. They don't think like humans. What they are is pattern matching engines. They work through first identifying patterns and then comparing new input to patterns. They have two basic functions. The first is capturing information. So, for example, you've seen vision recognition with facial recognition software, and you may even have your photographs on a service like the Google Cloud, where it will identify quickly and generally accurately people within your photographs just based on vision recognition. There's sound recognition. For example, the Siri or Alexa systems that can transcribe what you say and turn it into a request or turn it into new text or an email message or something of that sort. The third is search, which is extracting data from unstructured documents or what we call big data, data with high volume, high variability, high velocity. A fourth is data analysis, finding previously unknown patterns within the data that you already have. So that's capturing information. A second category is turning that information into something useful. So one piece is called natural language processing, where you take what can be found in an email message or a text or even the tone in a voice and get something useful about the caller or the author. A second is reasoning. The devices can decide, should I act on the information given? They might optimize how you act on the information given. And self-driving vehicles are perhaps the example that is making all the headlines now, where you have a self-driving car making decisions to optimize its path. But the same reasoning could be used, for example, should we have the accounting system send a dunning notice to a customer? And the final one here is prediction. Predicting buyer behavior based on past purchases is an example, but prediction might also be which of our insurance clients might be most likely to file a fraudulent claim, which of our creditors is most likely to go bankrupt, and so forth. And as Rohit mentioned, those can be extraordinarily valuable functions in an outsourcing environment, because currently much of outsourcing is relatively robotic, but also involves a certain measure of judgment that is reflecting past patterns and making reasoning and predictions to optimize. While robotic process automation provides greater efficiency, AI and similar technologies like machine learning, cognitive computing, deep learning, and so forth provide effectiveness. And we think that's why in 2016, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Oracle, SAP, and Salesforce all declared that AI was their top strategic focus.
So a key difference, for AI that we'd like to point out is that you don't program, you don't really program, bug fix, improve AI in the way that you would with traditional software. The programmer's role isn't to sit there and continue to iteratively encode the software with instructions. Instead, what the programmer would do is train the AI. It's more like the way you train people. You give them examples. For example, if you want to train a neural network or AI to recognize a cat, you don't tell it to look for whiskers and ears and fur and eyes. You just show it thousands and thousands of pictures of cats, and eventually it figures it out. If you then show it a fox and it thinks it's a cat, you don't go back and rewrite the code. You just identify the fox as a not cat, and then you show the AI hundreds and hundreds of foxes, and eventually it can distinguish foxes from cats. Demis Hassabis, the leader of Google's DeepMind AI team, said, training AI systems is almost like an art form to get the best out of these systems. There's only a few hundred people in the world who can do that really well. In addition, the AI also functions like a black box. You can't dissect the code to see how it does its work. In a wonderful Wired magazine article that we've cited on this page, because we do think it's very well worth reading, Jason Katz said, with machine learning, the engineer never knows precisely how the computer accomplishes its tasks. The neural network's operations are largely opaque and inscrutable. In other words, it is a black box. So how does that make AI different than RPA? Unlike RPA, which follows its rules in the same way over time, an artificial intelligence system trains itself or can be trained, as we just discussed, to automate more complex and subjective work through pattern recognition. IBM Deep Blue can learn to be the world's chess champion, IBM Watson can become the world's Jeopardy champion, et cetera. In addition, AI, unlike RPA, which requires things that are definable, repeatable, rules-based, as Brad mentioned, AI can process the unstructured data, work with variable inputs, and as you know, as we move into the big data world, we're looking at a high volume, high variety data with variable formats, with variable accuracy or veracity. And so AI can actually work with this type of big data where RPA would struggle much more. And then, unlike RPA, which is fixed and moves kind of in its direction regardless of what happens in the environment, AI is designed to respond to changes in the environment and adapt and learn so that it can be used in places where a process is not really sufficiently repeatable or repetitive to trust RPA. And finally, what does this mean? With RPA, you could replace human labor, replace human tasks. With AI, you may be able to replace certain elements of human analysis and human thinking.
So with that, let's talk about some new capabilities with RPA and AI in the context of outsourcing. First, data security. We all know this is an absolutely critical issue, and we all know that human involvement is not only costly, but actually adds to the threat surface in some ways. If you can move a function to RPA or AI or some combination, you may be able to execute that process without the danger of humans looking at sensitive data. And that would give you the ability to outsource much more sensitive processes because you don't have the threat that some of the people at the outsourcer will use that data or take that data or modify that data in ways that might hurt you. A second idea is to promote self-service. A large driver of cost of outsourcing is the cost of having people who work with callers. Those might be employees, they might be customers, they might be suppliers, and work with customers to provide data. The more self-service you can accomplish, the lower your costs will be. And RPA and AI could be a means of deploying new self-service solutions where the robots either simply mimic the behavior of humans, as I'm sure you've seen with a lot of automated telephone tools already in your own life as a consumer, and to use AI tools such as voice recognition to do back-end transcription and processing activities. It may also, with RPA and AI, give you the opportunity to promote use of big data. The RPA software is adept at going to multiple data sources. For example, if you have 6 different applications which have relevant data, and there might be 3 or 4 different public websites to check, and perhaps there's a state database, you could use RPA software to go through the manual process of assembling the big data on a topic, and then use AI software to do at least the first level of reasoning and analysis using its pattern matching engine. A fourth one, you could create new interfaces with new cloud-based systems. Most of our customers are actively involved in bringing in more and more cloud-based systems. And with every new cloud-based system, you need new interfaces to your legacy systems, your core systems of record. RPA is an effective way to build those interfaces quickly. And because cloud-based tools are often designed with RPA in mind, an analyst can often, in a course of a couple of weeks, develop an RPA solution that works well with cloud-based systems. A fifth idea is to overcome geographic hurdles. There are countries where you are unable to export the personal data. There are situations where you are unable to export other sorts of data. For example, the United States prohibits export of certain dual-use technologies or military technologies. With RPA and AI, instead of an outsourcing service provider needing to have a person in country to deal with in-country data, it can have a server in country dealing with in-country data. And we see substantially more to come. One source estimates that RPA alone can impact about 20 to 40% of back office processes globally. There was a World Bank report last year suggesting that over 70% of the work being done in China and India could be replaced by RPA and AI tools, the tools that we have now if implemented as people expect.
So what is the effect of RPA and AI on the outsourcing industry, and specifically on labor requirements, as Brad was just mentioning? Well, let's look at the history a little bit. So 2 decades ago, we were focused on taking a group of onshore people and then moving them to a service provider who had better tools, better processes, better focus to achieve results. Then we had kind of the last decade where we moved that generally offshore to less expensive labor, but generally with similar numbers of people. We believe that the next decade will be about replacing some of the cheaper labor that we've been using for defined, repeatable rules-based tasks, replacing that with RPA. And we've spent the last, 2 decades with many of you and with many of our clients documenting these rules-based tasks as part of our contracting efforts, whether that's through SOWs or, policy and procedures manuals. This area is actually ripe for this type of change because the existing rule sets are there in place already. How else does it affect labor? It's possible that one licensed software robot could replace multiple FTEs. One case study showed that 10 software robots could replace 20 human FTEs. A piece of software can work, of course, without breaks, without shifts, without extensive training and so forth. And that's what, causes that efficiency. On top of that, the software robots are able to perform their functions way more accurately. Humans are fantastic in a lot of different ways. We can adapt to changes, new environments. We can innovate, solve unexpected problems, but we're not great at manual and repetitive rules-based tasks. On top of that, it's possible to scale with software robots with relatively low marginal costs. Assuming that license fees stay low, the customer can add, RPA and scale with changing volumes in a much more rapid manner without the knowledge transfer or training required for a new employee. Critical roles then in the future will be around AI training or working with software robots with AI tools. So you'll need to keep that in mind when training or recruiting the personnel you'll need in this kind of new environment. Next one. So our sense is that, even if in the short term, even if, the outsourcing providers have the ability to resist these technologies, the reality is that there already is a limit to labor arbitrage that everybody is recognizing. There's been such a demand for offshore cheap labor that the labor arbitrage opportunities are actually declining because of the increased demand. The offshore outsourcing providers here have a great deal at stake. Their whole model to date has been based on employing as many people as possible. And this involves up to 3 million people in India just on the BPO side, another million in the Philippines. But, this challenge has been well recognized by outsourcing service providers. They're really taking the opportunity to preemptively develop their own RPA and AI solutions to stay relevant to customers, even if in the short term that damages their own business models. At least, they can stay in the game. So we're seeing these firms attack this through a couple of different ways, through acquisition and investment. Cognizant acquired Robotic, Genpact acquired Rage Frameworks, Wipro has an AI platform they've created called Homes, Accenture has MyWizard, TCS has Ignio, which actually is its own standalone platform, so they're even moving into the space of being a SaaS provider. And we're seeing them also do this through partnership with RPA and AI vendors. Brad mentioned Automation Anywhere, Blue Prism, UiPath, IPsoft. These are all partnerships that they've made with these vendors so that they can bring these tools to bear in their outsourcing relationships.
So what does RPA and what does AI mean for your outsourcing contracts? As Rohit said, this is a real threat to the traditional outsourcing model, and some people are touting the idea that the traditional labor arbitrage model is entirely dead. what do you do now? The first step is to think about restructuring your existing contracts. Many of the service providers are already leveraging RPA and AI to dramatically lower their costs without passing the savings on to their customers, without going through change management processes, which would require that customer risks be thoroughly considered and addressed. And what we've found is most outsourcing contracts written years ago did not contemplate today's fast-moving technology. And as a result, your providers may have little barrier to using AI and RPA, and they have little barrier to doing so without the changes required in the contract to address legitimate customer concerns, in addition to obtaining a piece of that savings. So as customers, you need to be proactive in demanding to share in the benefits of these RPA and AI innovations, and to obtain appropriate protections where your contract had assumed that you were protected because humans were involved in performing the process. Second idea, when you go out for any new outsourcing project today, include requests for RPA and AI capabilities in your RFP. That should be a criterion for your evaluation and selection of outsourcing service providers. It should be a strategic consideration as you decide what the scope is. For example, are the RPA and AI solutions going to be implemented at the customer site with the service provider providing the people and working with the solutions, or is the service provider bringing both the automation and the people who work with the automation? And you may find that you are shifting your collection of service providers. As Rohit said, the service provider community has done a great deal to bring out new tools, but you may find that the service provider that's right for you as you look forward may not be the one that's right for you as you look backward because of the type of AI and RPA they are implementing.
So you've been through the RFP process, as Brad mentioned. You've asked your vendors to come forth with their RPA and vendor solutions or AI solutions. Now what do you do? What do you do with your contracts? Do you go with what you have in your contract today? The answer is no. First of all, the adoption of RPA and AI will involve transformation of your environment. You may be, breaking down processes and distinguishing repeatable portions of those processes versus the unique and non-repeatable portions. You'll be taking things that are done by your people manually and then converting them to be automated. So this will involve a significant amount of transformation, and with any transformation, you need to have a transformation plan. You have to think through what incentives there have to be to ensure a successful transformation is achieved, whether that's milestones, credits, whatever they may be. Then you have to think through what contractual commitments you need to put in place. So will you be able to approve or disapprove the vendor's use of RPA and AI solutions? Are there options for you in terms of which packages to use, who pays for them, and if the RPA or AI involves the licensing of tools from a third party like Automation Anywhere or Blue Prism, which party is the licensee and how does that affect what rights you have on exit? How do you ensure that the RPA or AI meets its specifications? What kind of warranties can you get, and what is the supplier's obligation to actually support and maintain the RPA? In many instances, the implementation of RPA and AI is much like application development and maintenance, whereas that is not the way your traditional BPO and outsourcing contracts may be structured. What testing then will be required to verify accuracy before inserting into a production environment? It's very critical, obviously, before you go live, that the RPA solutions and AI solutions are tested and ready to be running. You'll have to obviously rethink service levels because now things are operating at a very different pace, different speed. Your old service levels may not make sense, and they may not make sense in terms of targets. They may not make sense overall. And we'll talk about this later, but we need a reasonable exit path as well as part of your contracting for these types of technologies.
This is a critical task with respect to contractual commitments, because often the outsourcing contracts that you have in place today were built on the assumption, and the previously safe assumption, that the work would be provided by humans. And humans are good at various types of adaptation. You can actually sit down with them and have weekly governance meetings. If you change a process in ways that cause problems, you can rely on them to raise their hand or raise a complaint and say, no, this is going to break my process. The robotic process automation and artificial intelligence are likely unable to do that. And so you need to rethink things like, how much am I relying on good and workmanlike conduct? And in that same vein, one thing to do is to consider, how can we restructure pricing for automated services? And an easy, simple approach should be to say, well, I'm pretty convinced that with RPA, we can cut price by, or we can cut costs by 10% or 20% or 30%. And as a result, what I'd like to see is a cost reduction commitment from the provider to requiring the provider to take advantage of cost reductions that are available with RPA and AI capabilities. And that could be as simple as putting on a ceiling number of FTEs and having that ceiling number of FTEs decline in a manner that essentially forces the supplier to remain profitable to adopt these technologies. However, a better approach, if possible, is to move to output-based measures or outcome-based measures instead of an input-based measure like an FTE. So you might, if you were outsourcing finance and accounting, instead of pricing based on the number of people working on the project, you would price based on the number of specific tasks performed, like invoices processed, or you might price based on the results achieved, like days sales outstanding. Another idea is to, probably before you get into this, analyze whether the use of RPA software will affect compliance with the licenses for your other software. Now, I'll use SAP as an example because they won a court case in the UK in similar facts. Imagine that you have a usage-based software license, and the number of users is the number of humans who have a logon. And currently, let's imagine that you've got 10 humans, and they're supporting a team of 100 other humans who are working on business processes of some sort. But it's only 10 users because only 10 people log on. Let's imagine that we take those 10 people and replace them with 5 robots. Now, you might say, well, software provider, we had a license for 10, we're only using 5, we're great. But SAP has a concept, indirect use, where they would say, no, what you've done is you've established a direct connection between the 100 people who are end users of the data in the system and the SAP core system itself. Numerous other providers of software take similar positions. And as a result, you might find a sort of a nasty pricing surprise as you move to an RPA or AI tool, because when you take the humans, the directly connected humans out of the equation, you might actually be indirectly connecting far more humans. Similarly, some of the usage-based software licensors or access-based software licensors have for years included provisions in their contracts saying that the software cannot be accessed by essentially an RPA or robotic means, and that it would be a breach of the license to do so. And their explanation in past years was, well, if a single software robot can do the work of 2 people or 10 people or 12 people, I'm being denied the benefits of what I'm offering to you. I'm actually providing you the benefits that you would have with 10 people working on this software. And so when I cut that back, when you cut that back to only a few people, I'm losing revenue, but you're not losing benefit. So it's well worth looking at the licenses, the software licenses you have that will be connected in some way to these new cognitive technologies.
Now, one of the key concerns in any outsourcing is what do you do on exit? You need to, a primary concern for the customer is to avoid being locked into a relationship with the provider, or alternatively to avoid or minimize any unexpected disruptions or high costs upon that exit. So the question that comes up on any RPA or AI implementation is what ownership rights or use rights do you have upon exit to avoid that lock-in? Are the RPA scripts useful, perhaps, if you don't have rights to the base software? I mentioned earlier that some of the systems being offered by providers are their own proprietary systems or uniquely licensed systems. Is it going to be usable if you don't have a license to the underlying system? Are, on the other hand, the business rules sufficient? In other words, as you construct the business rules that are going to be taken and implemented, and as we know for RPA software, it's definable, repeatable steps, as mentioned before, is it sufficient to maintain rights to those business rules so that you can replicate those steps and translate them in another RPA implementation? So we also talked about earlier how AI is a black box and how AI learns and is trained. So the question for an AI implementation that comes up is, what rights do you have to the AI software that has been used in the business as it gets, smarter and learns more about your particular business? And this is a complicated question because the AI in your environment grows and learns and is somewhat unique to your business, but at the same time, as many providers will tell you, part of the benefit of the AI solution is that it's learning from a vast majority of clients and learning and improving, and the benefit that they would like to share amongst their clients is kind of the aggregate improvement or intelligence that has been gained in that particular AI solution. So it's certainly a conflict or an area of interest from both sides in terms of a buyer or a customer wanting to protect any competitive interests that they have versus a service provider wanting to improve their solution over time.
When Rohit said that you should watch out for a lock-in to an RPA or AI solution, and one of the risks in being locked into an RPA or AI solution is that that becomes the inflexible element in the design of your infrastructure, and instead of improving your flexibility, it reduces it. You need commitments to adapt the AI and the RPA solutions to the changes that you make in your systems. And otherwise, if the existing systems themselves change, the software robots might not, and that would mean that rules and workflow will break. In some cases, the concern is that the RPA provider is a small company that may not be around or may not be willing to make long-term commitments. In other cases, it's that you have an outsourcing provider who is providing an RPA solution that must change as you change your other software. And it's well worth making sure that those changes are being done on a timely basis as a critical part of your outsourcing services. What some of our clients are doing to address that risk and to make sure that they have the flexibility to change the RPA and AI software as the rest of their business change is that the customers are retaining responsibility for some RPA and AI software. And there are a couple of models here. One is the customer remains the licensee, and the customer has the ability to go in to make the changes, to use the same software across multiple outsourcing providers, perhaps having the outsourcing provider build the robots, make the changes, and so forth, but the customer retains the license. In some cases, in other cases, the customer wants to host the RPA or AI software itself and have the outsourced function include working with it, just in the same way as a customer has traditionally maintained ownership of core assets and brought in service providers through outsourcing to provide the labor to maintain and operate those core assets. We found that none of these are particularly easy solutions because of the novelty of the technology and the very strong desire by both providers and customers to maintain control of this critical and evolving technology. However, there's a great deal of value here and is well worth working on. I'll turn it over to Rohit for a few conclusions.
So, what we've been talking about is that first and foremost, we think RPA and AI are going to have enormous impacts on companies, how they operate, how they outsource, what services they buy. And as we've noted, we think we're still at a very early phase of this. This is going to have enormous long-term impacts in our view because the traditional outsourcing delivery model is under threat. The FTE-based model certainly is under threat. But as we've talked about, most service providers are aware of this and are responding rapidly, and in particular, those that are the most under threat, the offshore service providers. We've actually done recent contracts that are offshored, and part of the proposals included substantial portions of the cost savings coming from RPA or AI. So what do you need to do about this? First, you need to reevaluate your existing contracts. Some of your providers may be either already experiencing dramatic cost reductions, or they are in the process of identifying opportunities to do so. But it's possible, as Brad said, that some of your existing contracts don't provide you the mechanism for sharing in those reductions, or they may not provide your providers with the incentives to reduce their FTE counts, especially for FTE-based pricing. So what we recommend is that for new sourcing contracts, for new outsourcing contracts, you have to factor in the commitments and incentives for providers to leverage RPA and AI. And as we noted, you have to think very carefully about what options you should be exercising to really protect you upon exit from these contracts. And that concludes our presentation. I think we will open it up to, is there one more slide, Brad, about the code?
I think at this point we do have a few minutes for a Q&A portion of the program, and if you have questions, please submit them electronically via the Q&A panel in the WebEx. As a reminder, if we don't get to your question during the program, we will make every effort to follow up with you after the program. There a couple of questions have come in. One, if I model outcome-based solely, doesn't that transfer all the future value to the outsourcer? Great question. Let me take the first shot, and we'll let Rohit take the second. If you enter into an outsource-based contract, an outcome-based contract with an outsourcing service provider, you do in a way say that you are buying an outcome, and to the extent that it gets cheaper, easier, and so forth to provide that outcome, the benefits do accrue to the outsourcing service provider. However, with luck, there are market pressures that help to bring down the cost and thus transfer some of that benefit to you in terms of price reduction on the specific outcomes that you're sourcing. Rohit, do you have any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, and we sometimes see productivity commitments. Essentially, I mean, we see it in FTE-based pricing, but we also see, there's a commitment by the service provider to achieve certain efficiencies over time, and that should be reflected even in the outcome-based pricing. So, there will be a certain glide path down in the outcome-based prices, and whether or not the supplier actually achieves the reductions, that price reduction happens. So that's a risk that they may, the supplier takes on the risk that they can't achieve those efficiencies, but they also are, and the customer is taking on the risk that they may get even more inefficient than projected. But it's certainly one mechanism we've seen to kind of implement and capture the concept that we do expect this not to be static over a 5-year contract. We do expect improvement over time. Another question that we received was who should own the RPA technology solution, the customer or the outsourced partner? And I think we touched on this a little bit in the presentation. There are various types of RPA solutions. You may have a outsourced service provider who has a proprietary RPA software solution. In that case, obviously, they are coming in and implementing and using their software solution. They will own that. The question is, what do you own in terms of the actual business rules that they're taking from you and implementing to then create a software robot, and how usable is that when you take it back? You know, our perspective is if it's that scenario, you should absolutely have the ability to retain the rights to the information that you provide that is used to create the rules that structure the robot. But there is also the scenario where the supplier has partnered with a third-party service provider like Automation Anywhere and is using their software. And we've seen clients, instead of allowing that relationship to be directly through the service provider, we've seen our clients, you know, go out and get their own license with Automation Anywhere for the software. And then the supplier simply comes in, I wouldn't say simply, but they come in and they use the customer's version of the software and implement the software robots in the customer's environment, and therefore the customer still continues to have that usage right through its own existing license with the software vendor. And that's a way to, again, avoid that type of lock-in with the service provider. Brad, do you have anything else on that?
It's a good question. It's, I think, a strategic question. If the RPA or AI technology is being used as part of your end-to-end digital transformation, if it's a part of merging the back office, the middle office, and the front office into one office, where, for example, you might be working to have your customers be able to directly access your back office systems. You know, a great, very traditional example is the way FedEx became so successful by allowing customers to rapidly access FedEx's back office systems to allow the customer to know exactly where their package is. If this is part of an end-to-end transformation delivering competitive advantage by delivering better products and services, then arguably there's a very strong reason for the customer to own it, and it's worth having the customer make a direct investment in ownership. However, traditionally, what companies have done is they've sought to outsource only functions that are traditional back office functions that don't affect competitive advantage. So, for example, the operation of their networks and the network optimization might be while important and cost-saving and providing benefits, not something that a company in most industries sees as a competitive advantage. It's also an area where a company might see it as a place where they would rather have the approach that Rohit has talked about, where you're getting the best results of many, many customers pooling all of their data on a single system and coming up with a kind of best practice. So, I'd say that if you're thinking about what the best practice is for who owns it, you have to step back to what is our company's digital strategy, and how does this particular RPA or AI technology fit into that overall strategy? A third question came up. What are the issues of interoperability? Are there open standards, or does the user have to negotiate and seek licenses for integration into the RPA? And let me take that one first. As lawyers, we can't tell you very much about the particular issues on interoperability, but RPA software is generally designed to act exactly like a human. So its entire design is intended to be very easy to interoperate technically. And AI, on the other side, is designed generally to work as a separate system on a separate database, an engine where you pour in data and it sends out insights. With respect to negotiating or seeking licenses for integration, there are some companies that have sought to limit the use of robotic process automation with their systems, but those are, by and large, the minority. Most of the software, most of the websites and so forth are agnostic as to whether they are being contacted by a robotic process or by a human. Obviously, there are some differences like this. We all know as consumers that there are sites where you need to prove that you're not a robot by doing a little bit of more sophisticated pattern recognition and so forth. But on balance, you'll need to get a license for the RPA software, and you may need to reconsider your licenses with other software providers, but it generally won't be prohibited or require additional negotiations. Rohit?
Right. And obviously you pointed out the kind of the occasional, not the occasional, but the SAP and Oracle, or the occasional vendors where you do have to take a close look at the indirect usage issue that Brad mentioned earlier as well. And then the final question is, the last question that I see on the screen here is, what is the real practical impact of AI and RPA on the role of in-house corporate counsels and on the legal industry in general? So I think this is asking more about legal process outsourcing specifically, which, we have seen, obviously, I've attended personally various conferences where we've seen the presentations on new AI tools, new software, I haven't seen RPA specifically, but that are, designed to automate a lot of the functions of a lawyer. And I think they're at various stages of the process. I think as lawyers, we should all pay attention a little bit to what's going on in the space. But there is incredible improvement and some incredible capabilities that we've seen in these areas, including having some advanced search capabilities for litigation matters where you don't necessarily need a first-year associate to do the initial search, et cetera. But we haven't actually, or at least I personally have not done too much work in this space in terms of contracting out our own profession. But Brad, I don't know if you have anything to add on that particular topic.
Yeah. The real and practical impact is very likely that we'll be processing a great deal more information. And as Rohit said, litigation has been far, far in front of this. The amount of the things that you can get off of Lexis and Westlaw and a service called Ross, which is an AI service which is designed specifically for bankruptcy law, and other pieces give us access, have in the past decade allowed us to go from having document discovery where 10,000 might be a lot of documents to now document discovery where 10 million is a lot of documents. And that is a sea change and has transformed the way in-house counsel and the legal industry in general looks at litigation. It's created new industry players like the LPO companies. It's not clear whether it's created more or less litigation or more or less legal work, but it certainly has created non-traditional competitors to the legal industry in general and companies that are focused on AI and technology. I'd like to bring the question around to a very specific piece on outsourcing, and that's that companies have thousands or even tens of thousands of sourcing contracts, and on the supply side they may have tens of thousands, and some companies have hundreds of thousands of customer contracts. And a problem has long been that if there is a major change, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act enacted, the European General Data Privacy Regulation will be effective in May 2018, and a company says, I need to look at all my contracts and find out whether they are ready for GDPR or whether they need to be amended for GDPR before May 2018. It's expensive to open up those contracts. It may be just to answer a simple question like, does this contract comply with the basic requirements of the GDPR for contracts of this type? It may be hundreds or even thousands of dollars per contract. Also, to enforce contracts is similarly expensive. You need to understand what the contract says. That is likely changing. We may be at a point where instead of it costing hundreds of dollars to answer simple questions about contracts, that may become a $10 or a $20 problem. And that's going to have a couple of effects on an in-house counsel in the legal industry. One is that if somebody says, how many of our 10,000 sourcing contracts, how many of them have a Foreign Corrupt Practices Act limitation, or how many of them deal with personal data in a manner that satisfies the GDPR? That question currently is very difficult to answer. By 2020, that might be an easy question to answer. You may have a database with an AI engine from a company like Seal or Kiro or Raven or many others that might be able to give you the answer and give you the answer quickly. Now, that's one effect is great. You can get answers to your questions, and you may be able to know what needs to be fixed much more easily. On the other side, though, your counterparties will also be able to look at their contracts at far less cost. And imagine hypothetically that the cost for one of your counterparties to open up the contract and find out whether you're in breach would look like, say, today $500, and in 2020 would look something like $5, just based on doing some RPA and AI and looking at your public filings and so forth, and then doing a quick review using automated tools. Where previously they might have said, it's just not worth the bother, we don't have the people to send a default notice under the contract, they may very well be able to send a default notice very quickly, easily, and well. And some companies have already gotten to the point where they're sending default notices and requests for additional money that are relatively small, sending out an invoice for an additional user for $100 or something of that sort. And companies today often look at those small invoices and say, well, it would cost me $500 to figure out whether this is true or false, so I'll just pay the $100 invoice. By 2020, you may be simply flooded with those sorts of small dollar automated problems coming into the law department, and problems that it would have been too expensive in 2017 to even open the contracts enough to send those notices, but cheap enough in 2020 to send those notices on a weekly or daily basis. And that will likely have a very practical impact on the role of in-house counsel, requiring either a new team of people to address what the robots are coming at you, what the robots at all of your counterparties are coming at you with, or some new robotic solution that you have to respond to those sorts of issues. So let me wrap up. Thank you on behalf of Mayor Brown, for me, and for Rohit George. We appreciate your time. We very much hope you found this program useful. If you have any thoughts on future programs or any ideas on how to improve this program, please do reach out to us. Also, please be on the lookout for future invitations to the next of our Future Technology Transactions webinar series, which I believe will be on the implementation of the GDPR. Some final housekeeping items for today's participants. A recording and a link to the materials from this program will be distributed by email in the next day or two. And if you have ideas for future programs or thoughts on this program, please email us at techtransactions@mayorbrown.com. Thank you. I will now turn the call over to the operator for closing formalities.